Hi, everyone. Wrapping up on the brutal murder of Emmett Till in 1955. Part one, we got to the point where I was describing the interaction that happened between Emmett and Carolyn Bryant in Bryant's store, and her husband, Roy Bryant, learning of this, notifying his half-brother J.W. Milam. And as we saw in the video clip that we watched from the History Channel documentary about this, the two of them go to Mose Wright's house in the middle of the night, showing up about 2:30 in the morning, and at gunpoint demand Emmett Till be turned over to them. They took him away and ended up beating him, torturing him, shooting him in the head, gouged out one of his eyes, part of an ear was missing, and they then dumped his body in the nearby Tallahatchie River and tried to weight it down in the water by tying a heavy piece of equipment, a cotton gin fan from a cotton ginning machine. They tied around Emmett's neck with barbed wire, tossed his body in the water, where it was discovered several days later near the spot by a kid who was fishing. We saw another version of this photo in class. Emmett's mother, Mamie Till, managed to get possession of his body, although it was a struggle with the local racist sheriff, and took Emmett's body back to Chicago, where she had an open casket service and said, I want the world to see what these people did to my son. Photographs like this of Emmett's corpse were published in Jet magazine, one of the most influential black magazines of the era, where they were seen by millions of black Americans across the country. They were horrifying, shocking. It was the first time that really a lynching like this, what this is, received national media attention, because the brutality of it, the fact that the victim, Emmett Till's a teenager, this was going to become a national news item, reported in the mainstream media and covered by television as well. So there's a trial. Milam and Bryant are arrested, charged with kidnapping, murder. Most of the evidence in the case, as I mentioned here, was collected by Medgar Evers, who was a field secretary who worked for the NAACP, a complete badass. He risked his life gathering most of this, and as I note here, Medgar Evers was going to be murdered in the driveway of his home by a Klansman in 1963. The real loss to the civil rights movement in which he was actively involved. This is the courthouse in the little town of Sumner, Mississippi, which was the county seat, and this is where the trial was held over a 5-day period in August of 55. So Milam and Bryant had this all-star team of lawyers who came from the state capital of Jackson and worked as a team to defend them pro bono, meaning they didn't charge. Each of them had 2 little boys that they paraded around constantly and held on their laps, with the purpose of this being to convey the idea that their husbands, fathers, family men, that they could not possibly have done this. The trial lasted 5 days. As we saw in the video segment we watched, the star witness was Moses Wright, who had received death threats and had been in hiding, but courageously came to court, stood up, and pointed directly at Bryant and Milam and identified them as the 2 men who came to his house and took Emmett away. The closing arguments on the Friday of the week of the trial, we saw in the video segment we watched Emmett's mom remembering how one of the attorneys told the jurors, "I know every last Anglo-Saxon one of you has the courage to free these men." This trial was a complete farce. There was no fear of conviction by either of these guys. As was the custom in Mississippi, the jury was all white, all male, even though Tallahatchie County, where this was held, was 63% black. And again, This is what systemic racism looks like. This is how it works. We still have vestiges of this in our criminal justice system today. There was no chance for justice to be achieved in this case because everything was organized in a way to uphold the existing white power structure. Later on, we're going to talk about the civil rights movement in the 60s and the efforts by Black Americans to exercise their right to vote. Critically important because it's only by suppressing people's right to vote that you can keep a structure like this in place. 63% of the county Black residents, and yet you look at the power structure in the county, there's not a Black mayor, there's not a Black sheriff, there's not a Black judge, there's not a Black city council member anywhere. It's all friggin' white people. And this trial is an example of how this works. Stretching it to even call it a trial in a way because the conclusion was foregone as to what would happen. Jury deliberated a total of 67 minutes, and one of the jurors later said, well, hell, we wouldn't have even taken that long except we took the time to drink a sody pop to make it look like we were actually deliberating back there. Nobody was surprised when they returned 67 minutes later with the verdict of not guilty. So there's this big, disgusting celebration that happens. We saw, those of you who attended the Zoom session that showed the reporter interviewing Milam and Bryant, and you saw Roy Bryant, putting his tongue down the throat of his wife for the television cameras. These people are repulsive in every way possible. Two grown men murder a child, really, a 14-year-old teenager, and get away with it because of this racist system in the American South. The fallout from this is because Bryant and Milam couldn't be charged with the same crime twice, that several months later, when they were offered either $4,000 or $5,000, depending on whose account you believe, by a freelance journalist to tell their story, they willingly did so, and it was published in a popular magazine of the era, Look magazine, which was a big kind of coffee table magazine, very similar to Life magazine at the time, really the main rival to Life magazine. And they gave this detailed description of how and why they murdered Emmett Till. It was very self-serving. They presented themselves as kind of the aggrieved parties. This kid didn't respect them and had to be taught a lesson. It's just horrifying on all levels. So there's no justice achieved in the case in terms of the court case. I mentioned that the local white community turned on and rejected these guys after they sold their story. They both promptly went out and blew their money on new cars. And it wasn't that the white community disapproved of what they did. The vast majority of white Mississippians in 1955 agreed that this heinous murder was justifiable. What people didn't like was them going public with it. And it shows how, at least by this time in 1955, standards had changed where you couldn't do this sort of thing openly anymore. You had to do it under cover of darkness without anybody seeing you, and then keep your mouth shut about it. As long as you did that, people would support you. But when Milam and Bryant went public about it, the local population largely shunned them. But again, this isn't because people are saying, oh my God, they really did it. Everybody knew they did it. It's just the fact that they went public with it, took money for it, that people turned against them. Black residents organized a boycott of Bryant's store, which drove it out of business under his ownership. Interesting that both the wives left their husbands, not immediately, but it wasn't too long in the future when both these marriages dissolved. The Bryants divorced. Milam's wife never divorced, but they lived separated for the rest of their lives. She moved away from him. Though it's odd, in some fundamental level, these women seem to have been troubled by this, but neither one had the courage to speak out against it, including Carolyn Bryant, whose exaggerated lie under oath about Emmett leaping over the counter and grabbing her around the waist and sexually propositioning her was a key bit of evidence in the trial, even though it was all made up. She's the only person that we've seen in these slides who's still alive. This case was reopened in Mississippi several years ago, and I was hoping that she would go to jail. I didn't care if she was 115 years old. The reason I say that is because Moses Wright's testimony, he said when Milam and Bryant came to his house, they marched Emmett out to a waiting car and asked somebody in the darkness, is this the right kid? And a woman's voice said, that's him. Well, logic would tell you that that voice would belong to Carolyn Bryant as the person who identified Emmett, which would make her an accessory to everything that happened, but she never was prosecuted. So part of the importance of this, as I mentioned to the class, is just the sheer brutality of it makes it significant, horrific, and deserving to be remembered. Second, it's the first incident of this sort that received national media attention. As I mentioned, it was widely covered on television, TV journalists, TV reporters were there. It's really the first thing that exposes Southern racism to the rest of the United States. And finally, this was a direct stimulant to the Montgomery bus boycott, which started just a few months later with Rosa Parks saying she was thinking about Emmett Till's murder the day she refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. And also, as I emphasized with you all when we went over this in class, there's a whole generation of Black Americans who were impacted by this, who were roughly Emmett Till's age. And when they become college students in the 60s, they become involved in the civil rights movement. These are the people that start the sit-ins in the early 60s and the voter registration drives and the freedom rides. They become the nucleus of the civil rights movement of the 60s. They were horrified by this, determined to change things. Many of them remembered vividly seeing the photographs of Emmett Till in Jet magazine and other Black publications, and they were determined that things had to change, and they become the core of the 1960s civil rights movement. So Emmett's murder has an immediate impact and a much broader long-range impact as well.